Bismillah wa salatu ala Rasulillah. I would like to welcome you in our webinar. We have a very interesting and important topic today, basically atherosclerosis. We are fortunate, we have a leader in the group. We have a leader in this topic in our kingdom. So in our journey of 2 hours, we're gonna basically try to answer a few questions. The first question, how big is the problem in our country? So without further ado, we would like to start with Prof. Khalid Al-Habib. He's a professor of internal medicine. He's a consultant cardiology, and he is one of the leader, if not the leader, of a research and publication in our country. His topic will be atherosclerosis, cardiovascular disease, the burden of the disease, and unmet needs. Dr. Khalid, the mic is yours.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Baha, for the kind introduction. Pleasure to be with all of you, and all people around here are great researchers and contributors to our research. I would like to thank Novartis for this kind invitation, and the Saudi Heart Association. So in the next 20-25 minutes or so, we'll go quickly over the atherosclerotic burden of cardiovascular disease in Saudi Arabia and the unmet medical need. So the burden of disease in Saudi Arabia, we'll get to the chase, and we'll start with this very important study published in the Lancet Planetary Health in 2020. And myself, among other collaborators in Saudi Arabia and in the Institute of Metrics for and in the Institute for Health Metrics Evaluation, the IHME in Seattle, Washington, collaborated together to come up with this study that basically went over the burden of disease and interestingly tried to compare 2 decades from 1990 for 10 years, and then followed that for another 10 years, and trying to compare what happened to the prevalence of cardiovascular disease, prevalence and mortality. And the first point is that you can see in Saudi Arabia compared to other countries, Saudi Arabia in light green color over the years from the 1990 to 2017, you can see the trend of dropping death per 100,000 population for all-cause age standardized mortality in Saudi Arabia. So the overall picture is very promising, that we're doing better over the years compared to the several years ago. However, we're kind of among the higher countries in terms of mortality in the region. Direct comparison, look at the overall pattern, that it is overall dropping in most of the countries, but we still would have been expected to have even lower mortality, if not the lowest in the region. The other important issue is the topic at hand, which is basically the cardiovascular disease. You can see by the size of the box the contribution for mortality. So you can see cardiovascular disease in blue color, the cardiovascular disease in blue color, and neoplasms and diabetes and kidney diseases. These are the NCDs, or non-communicable diseases. And you can see by the size of the box the contribution to mortality. And as expected, cardiovascular disease represent the major cause for mortality. And this is from 1990 to 2010. Now, if I flip to the other slide, if you see the same color changing to gray, that means it stabilized or even decreased in the next 10 years. So in this, the same kind of diagram, but this time from 2010 to 2017, the following decade, you can see cardiovascular diseases in gray color, diabetes and kidney disease in gray color. That means that the prevalence have stabilized, if not dropped. So if I go back and forth, that basically shows you still the major cause of mortality in Saudi Arabia, the cardiovascular diseases. However, you can see from 1990 to 2010, this has dropped over in the next decade of 2010 to 2017. With the improvement in the healthcare in Saudi Arabia, this is not surprising. So overall, we're doing good, but we're aiming for even better in the future. And you can see that in the 1990, the leading cause for mortalities and all-cause years life with disability is malnutrition. However, high body mass index and high fasting blood glucose and dietary risks and high blood pressure are among the leading causes for life with disability in 2017. So it's not only important to look at mortality, also to look at life with disability. So our goal is not only to add years to our life, but to add life to our years. So in conclusion, the reduction in mortality continued at a greater rates in Saudi Arabia during the period of 2010 to 2017 than in 1990 to 2010. And the health-related index also improved. And public health policymakers in Saudi Arabia need to increase efforts to address preventable risk factors that are major contributors to the burden of ill health and disability. Now, I'll be talking a lot referring to the PURE study. I've been part of this study since 2010. It's an international study led by Salim Youssef from McMaster. And basically, it's over almost reaching 250,000 population from all over the world, involving all these countries, almost now going to 27 countries or more. And other countries in the region include United Arab Emirates, our country, Palestine, Turkey, and Iran. And the benefit of this international cohort, that basically you're comparing apples to apples. So whatever being measured is being measured in all these countries at the same rate, at the same standardized way. And when you report data, you at least can compare your data to other countries. And we publish our own local study from the PURE in this publication in BMC Public Health. You can access it for free in open access, and describing the demographic, behavioral, and cardiovascular risk factors in the Saudi population of over 2,000 subjects recruited since 2012. And following these people over the last several years, we're now going into the 9th year of follow-up. And as you can see from this diagram, divided patients or population rather, or subjects, because many of them might not be patients from the community, the overall in blue colored, men in orange color, and women in gray color. And as you can see, men overall are higher than women in most of the risk factors of cardiovascular disease. Women are slightly higher in obesity. However, men are almost the same, if not higher than women. The other major takeaway from this, which has been shown in other cross-sectional studies in Saudi Arabia, the proportion of low physical activity is extremely high, almost reaching 70%. Obesity in the range of 40 to 60%, particularly in women, and the unhealthy diet, hypertension, diabetes, and dyslipidemia in the range of 30% or more. So we have a high prevalence of cardiovascular disease risk factors, and unfortunately, one of the major drawback from the rapid urbanization in the last 3 decades. When you move and divide these subjects by cutoffs, age cutoffs, as expected, as you get older, you have more risk factors for heart disease. But what is intriguing and depressing from this diagram that shows you that basically low physical activity in the younger subjects and the middle-aged subjects in orange color are very similar to the elderly. So our younger quote-unquote patients or subjects in the population are almost living in their 70s and 60s, while they are in their 30s and 40s. Unfortunately, their weight is high and unhealthy diet is even worse than the elderly. And when you go into urban and rural, and this is one of the benefits of the PURE study that looked at and compared urban area and a rural area, we took the rural area from outside Riyadh, and you can see that the rural area is not rural anymore. It's actually the same high prevalence of cardiovascular risk factors as urban, if not even higher. And that I have to say, this kind of cohort was taken from the Riyadh region, in Mantaqat Riyadh, and now we're expanding to the Western region as well. So high prevalence of cardiovascular disease risk factors, and mostly in men more than women, and younger are the same, if not worse, than elderly population when it comes to lifestyle behaviors, and rural is becoming urbanized. So again, not sure whether we have any true rural in Saudi Arabia. Everybody is now having a driver and a housemaid, and they rarely move. And even in farmers, they are hiring people to do their job that you used to do 3 decades ago. Moving on to and summarizing hypercholesterolemia, which is the major subject for today in Saudi Arabia. If you look at the studies over the years, I have summarized this in this diagram that looks in the 1980s, and then the CADIS study by Professor Mansour Nuzha and Arafa and others, the well-known CADIS study in the 2000, and then the WHO in 2005, the stepwise approach survey, and the Saudi Health Survey by the Ministry of Health, Dr. Ziad Mimish, and then the PURE study. And you can see the prevalence of hypercholesterolemia probably in the range of 30 to 40%. You have to take this with a caution, because some of these studies, they enroll subjects more than 15 years of age, while PURE and the CADIS, they looked at 35 years of age or more. So when you look at population studies, you have to be careful about the inclusion age criteria, the age criteria included in the study. So if you probably include the age of 30 or above in the Saudi Health Survey and the WHO survey, probably you reach 30 to 40%. So you would comfortably think that hypercholesterolemia in Saudi Arabia will probably in the range of 30 to 40%. So probably 1/3. So every 10 subjects that come to the overall, to the all comers come to the clinics, primary care, what have you, probably 3 of them have, every 10, 3 of them will have high cholesterol. When we looked only at the Middle East, again, going back to PURE, only in these countries, the United Arab Emirates in blue color, Iran in orange color, Palestine in gray color, and Saudi Arabia, you can see the prevalence of hypertension in the different countries, very similar to each other. And the overall, the prevalence is 33% of hypertension in these countries. Awareness is only 50%, treatment is only 50%, and controlled blood pressure is only 19%. So it's not only high blood pressure, high prevalence of risk factors, they are more likely to be uncontrolled as well. And this has been shown in international studies and also in our region. When we looked at the inequalities, depending on the socioeconomic status, another paper from PURE, including Saudi Arabia, published in the Lancet Global Health. And you can see the prevalence of cardiovascular disease in Saudi Arabia is 3.4%. And when we looked at the giving 3 or more secondary prevention of drugs, you can see in Saudi Arabia, these are essential medications that need to be given to patients with already ischemic heart disease. Only 24.6% got these medications, while 1 or more secondary prevention drug is 72%. And what we mean by that, aspirin, beta blockers, statins, and so on. And focusing on the dyslipidemia, again, only 41% in Saudi Arabia in this cohort had statins. So again, showing the same issue in dyslipidemia. It's not only we have high prevalence, we give it to a small number of patients and we don't control them very well. And this is different according to your socioeconomic status. And this is the novelty in the study, that basically, if you look at the poor tertile compared to the middle tertile, compared to the richest tertile in green color, you can see in Saudi Arabia there is a high variability. So it's very high variability whether you're poor, middle, or rich. While the more that these columns become narrower, there is less variability. So this basically tells you that it's not only different from the different countries, as you can see here, There's different ways, different achievement of targets of giving these essential medications to those with cardiovascular disease. Even in the same country, like Saudi Arabia, it depends whether you're poor or rich. So it really makes a difference by your socioeconomic status. While a rich country like Canada or Sweden, you can see in the left side here, there is not much difference whether you are poor or rich. If you look at other studies for dyslipidemia, there are well-known studies, the CFIUS and the DICES Middle East, and quickly the CFIUS in 6 Arabian countries conducted more than 10 years ago, over 5,000 patients already on statins, and you can see that those who are already on statins, 91% of the low-risk group achieved the LDL cholesterol goal, only 52.7, only around half of the high risk, and 32% of the very high risk did achieve it. So showing again that we do not achieve the targets in half, if not even more, in 70% of our high risk patients. Look at the DICES Middle East, which is a sub-study from the overall DICES study. Again, looked at these countries, Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, and Jordan, 2,000 patients. And again, 61.8% of all patients did not achieve the targets. And this study, and the ECLIPSE study published in the European Journal of Preventive Cardiology, followed these 3 studies, again showing that those who achieve the targets are very low. In the green, light green and dark green, only 10 to up to 30% achieve the target. Otherwise, once your patients are high risk, it is really in the minority of patients who achieve the target. So we have a problem about achieving the targets in our region and even internationally, as has been shown in other studies. But I'm here really focusing mainly on the in our region. Why is that? Well, it has been really a subject of debate. Is it because we have physician inertia, we don't treat people very well, or we really don't have the concept of aggressive treatment? Statins maybe are not enough. We need really to start combination therapy very early on. Or is it because of basically generics? We have this book, A Bottle of Lies, basically talks about how many of the generic medications might not work. So we're really, do we have this problem here in Saudi Arabia? I'm just putting it as a provocative question, because many of our government hospitals particularly switch to generics. And at least myself, I'm getting every now and then one patient saying, well, doctor, these medications are not working. The original medication that used to give it to me is actually used to work. So this is something to think about. How about genetics? Well, I talked about lifestyle, behaviors, and so on. We just reported our familial hypercholesterolemia registry recently, published in the Public Library of Science in June 2021. Again, it's open access, so you can access it for free. And basically showing we have high prevalence of familial hypercholesterolemia, 1 in every 112 of heterozygous FH. Homozygous is obviously rare, but heterozygous FH is actually more common than you think. And this prevalence is 3 times the prevalence of what has been reported worldwide. The overall prevalence reported worldwide in many studies and meta-analysis has been shown to be 1 in 300. So our prevalence is 3 times the prevalence of the FH worldwide. And the achievement of LDL cholesterol and non-HDL cholesterol, again, is extremely low. And this has been shown in other recent publication in the Lancet, and we have been part of this, our FH registry has been part of this global registry. I really urge you to read this seminal paper and landmark paper published in the Lancet by Kaushik Ray and others. And again, showing the same issue. Once you look at FH, extremely low level of achievement of target in those with heterozygous FH, as we have shown in our region and also internationally. And what does this lead to? Well, it leads to high prevalence of hitting patients with acute coronary syndrome at younger age in our population. We have been doing ACS registries for the last 15 years or more, and with all fancy names, SPACE, Gulf Race, STARS, now running STARS 2 in our country. And we have shown in more than 34,000 ACS patients recruited from many registries in our region, Saudi Arabia and the Gulf, that we have almost 10 years younger when patients come in with acute syndrome, very high risk factor, prevalence of risk factors, LV dysfunction, people presenting late, and they have severe diffuse coronary artery disease at much younger age compared to the Western countries and industrialized countries. And we're only looking at the tip of the iceberg. The study looks at the MESA study and the PISA study in Spain. And this is one of them, showing that basically, even if you're looking at your patients with normal LDL, many of them are having subclinical atherosclerosis. This Spanish population, almost 50% of them have subclinical atherosclerosis. If you look at, if you start doing ultrasound carotid or ultrasound to the peripheral arteries, let alone the full-blown coronary artery disease. So this is a very interesting research question by itself. What is the prevalence of subclinical atherosclerosis in our population? And does that have an impact on economy? I just quoted the study that was just published a few days ago. Lucky for us to actually having been published just before our symposium. And just looking at the economic cost of obesity and overweight, and you can see in this study, the impact of overweight and obesity for these diseases is found to directly cost a total of $3.8 billion, equals to 4.3% of the total health expenditures in Saudi Arabia in 2019. And the estimated overweight and obesity attributable abstinence and pristinism and costs at a total of $15.5 billion and equal to 0.9% of the GDP in 2019. So it's not only causing health and people losing their lives, but it's costing money and basically directly or indirectly. I will finish by these quick slides. Basically, we're running now the Gulf Achievement of Cholesterol Targets in Outpatient Study, which is Gulf Action Study, and almost reaching 2,000 subjects. And it will be Gulf Action, the most up-to-date study about assessing management of dyslipidemia and why we do not achieve the target. Previous studies have looked only at the percentage of achieving the target, but they didn't go into the details of physician surveys and patient surveys about dyslipidemia and up-to-date management and drugs, the novel drugs that we're going to hear about them today. And if you're interested, let me know so I can get you involved in the study. It involves 5 Arabian Gulf countries and involves outpatients who have been already on statins for 3 months or more, and see whether primary or secondary prevention, and see whether they achieve the target or not. And I will also urge you to look at this very important document published by Dr. Adel Gneibet about NCDs in Saudi Arabia toward effective intervention for prevention. It's a very nice comprehensive document that goes over the NCDs in Saudi Arabia divided by age and sex and so on. Very important document that has been released recently. And last but not the least, what do we do ourselves as individuals? I'm happy to say that بفضل I established a charity organization, جمعية خيرية اسمها جمعية مكافحة أمراض القلب النبضات. And last month, after 1.5 years of working on this, we launched a mobile truck donated by one of my patients actually. And we released this truck that in February, and we screened over 100 subjects from front of one of the malls, and we screened many people, educated them, did a portable echo, did vitals, did blood sugar, high cholesterol, discovered many patients with high blood sugar and high blood pressure. So this is one of the initiatives to trying to educate the public, try to screen them and help about primary prevention as well. Summarize all of this in one slide. Our population is a high-risk cardiovascular population. We have a lot of interesting lifestyle. You know what I mean, with truncal obesity that leads metabolic syndrome and resistant hypertension, resistant diabetes. Bombarded by very bad weather recently, and ever, living in a desert, very bad weather. So asking people to go outside to do exercise is kind of a joke, particularly in these kind of days with a lot of dust and pollution. So it prevents people from going outside and biking and doing exercise. We have to depend on a lot of indoor exercise and adopting the Western lifestyle of high calorie foods and smoking, particularly in younger women. I'm not sure whether you noticed this, but I have noticed this myself with a lot of cafes outside and e-cigarettes and so on. So younger population think that e-cigarettes is less risky. It is as risky, if not more. And we have uncontrolled risk factors in 30 to 50% after 1 year. In our ACS registries, when we follow them after 1 year, almost 1/3 to 50% of them have uncontrolled risk factors. And I've told you already about genetics. So it's not only we have bad lifestyle, we might have high prevalence, high propensity to have coronary artery disease at younger age because of our genes. So, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, the two take-home messages from my presentation: we have high cardiovascular burden that present at younger age. Not only we have high burden of coronary artery disease risk factors, but we have uncontrolled risk factors as well. We're not achieving the targets, particularly in a lower socioeconomic status. I could argue that we need a huge study about assessing subclinical atherosclerosis as well, even in those with normal LDL. And we have high prevalence of familial hypercholesterolemia in our region that is costing us a lot. I have shown you already that we have a high cost in a recent study about obesity only, let alone about other diseases. And there is an urgent need for innovative and efficient strategies and therapies to result in sustainable achievement of targets. And this is the buzzword, sustainable achievement of the different targets, particularly dyslipidemia. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you, Prof. Khalid, for your elegant talk. And you showed us how big is the problem in our country and how we are so behind and how basically lazy, we're becoming lazy and with less workout. So for next topic, we have Dr. Osama Al-Bashir. He's a consultant cardiologist in Advanced Medicine Center. He has been a consultant in a specialized medical center for 20 years. He has a specific interest in preventive cardiology and hypercholesterolemia. He will talk today about cumulative exposure theory. And Dr. Osama, the mic is yours.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Thank you, Novartis, for inviting us to participate in this symposium. And I thank Mr. Chairman for his kind words. I'm going to talk about the LDL cumulative exposure theory. These are my disclosure. Short introduction, then we talk about elevated LDL as a causal to atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease and the cumulative exposure theory. We review quickly the recent ACC, AHA, and the European Society of Cardiology guidelines for treatment of dyslipidemia. And we talk about the unmet needs in the treatment of dyslipidemia. Prof. Khalid talked to us about the local data about the prevalence of the disease. Here a slide to talk about the overall prevalence in the world. So number one cause of death is for sure cardiovascular disease. That's worldwide. When we say cardiovascular disease here, we mean the ischemic heart disease and a stroke and peripheral arterial disease. So they together they constitute about nearly 18 million deaths per year, while cancer makes only about 9 million deaths. This is a slide to show the prevalence is actually going higher in most developing countries. these two is India and, or rather the Southeast Asia and China. This is Southeast Asia and China for sure is both of them, large population, and it's going up, while in Europe and America, it is going up maybe slowly, not as like here. And the thing that has happened over the last 10 years or 20 years or so is that now, number one, developing and developed countries is cardiovascular disease. About 20 years ago, that's in the cause of death in the West, while in developing countries, you find that the infectious diseases were number one cause. But over the last 10 years, unfortunately, the developing countries stayed poor, but now they're catching up with the developing countries in the prevalence of the cardiovascular disease. When we say cardiovascular disease, we mean coronary heart disease, we mean stroke, and we mean peripheral arterial disease. Of course, the majority is coronary heart disease. A stroke comes number 2, and the peripheral arterial disease is number 3. But as you all know, the pathology is the same as the atherosclerosis of the medium arteries, and leads to a formation of the atherosclerotic plaque, and ultimately leads to the complications that we all know from acute myocardial. The LDL is a major risk factor for atherosclerosis. So how does elevated LDL contribute to the atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease? We all know that there are different factors. Perhaps the high cholesterol, the high LDL in particular, is a major, if not the most important risk factor. But the factors, as we all know, there are modifiable factors and non-modifiable. So the non-modifiable, the age, as we get older, we are more at risk. Certain ethnic groups, they have more prevalence of cardiovascular disease. Gender, so before the menopause, for sure the ladies are protected. So the men, they get the disease early, but after the menopause, the women, they catch up with men. Like 10 years after the menopause, they are the same, and maybe in the elder ages, they are even more than men. So we have the other risk factors, the modifiable risk factors. There are behavioral risk factors like the tobacco use and high alcohol consumption, unhealthy diet, and low physical activity, and hypertension, diabetes, hypercholesterolemia, and abdominal obesity, the metabolic ones. And then there are other risk factors like chronic kidney disease and inflammatory disease. This is the pathology we all know, so we will not take time to talk about. It starts as atherosclerotic streaks, and then there is a plaque, becomes clear, and then after that, it ruptures and leads to the acute event. It's been shown that by the time, at the time of we are born, the LDL level tends to be between 60 to 70. Of course, there are certain inherited diseases where even this is high, but generally we until we reach puberty, the LDL gets higher, and it becomes in the range of 120, 125. So the majority of the cholesterol, it comes by the time we reach the puberty. So those who have inherited disease, they tend to be to have high cholesterol at this very early age, And by the time they reach 20 or 30, maybe they already have some degree of atherosclerosis. So the people with familiar dyslipidemia, they are particularly exposed to the risk associated with elevated LDL, since they have this elevated LDL from the beginning. And the development that comes for people not suffering from this condition over the the first 2 decades of life, it's only up to 120, 125, while these people with familiar dyslipidemia, they are born with a high LDL, and then in their early years, when they are 10 or 15, their LDL may be very high, a few hundreds, they may be 200, 300. And of course, it is asymptomatic disease, but it works on the vascular tree and leads to increased atherosclerosis, development of the atherosclerotic plaque, and maybe even sometimes when they have very high level, they develop myocardial infarction at the age of 20 or so. So in a 20 years follow-up study, by initiating statin therapy in the families where this dyslipidemia is there, so the patients are screened at a young age, and when they gave them a statin at a young age, it's been shown that after 20 years of treatment, that they slowed the progression of the carotid intima media thickness and reduced the risk of cardiovascular disease in adulthood. So it is needed that we detect these people early and we start to treat them early, because it's been shown with this cumulative exposure theory that the burden of the atherosclerotic plaque related to the level of the LDL and the duration of the high LDL. So if they postulated that patients with very low LDL throughout their life of 80 milligram of LDL, the mean age to develop MI would be at the age of 100. So if we can keep the LDL throughout life in this range, or those who are lucky, were born with certain conditions where the level of LDL is low, they develop the MI by the age of 100 if they survive till that time. While if the LDL is kept throughout life, 125, the mean age of the MI will be 60. And then those who have severe dyslipidemia, just by having an LDL of 200, and as you know, these people, they can have the LDL much more than 200. So then the mean age of myocardial infarction will be in the 20s, 20 to 30 years of age. So to summarize the previous slide, that atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease is the leading cause of cardiovascular morbidity and mortality. Familiar hyperdyslipidemia is a condition caused by genetic disorder affecting cholesterol metabolism, and distribution is characterized by high level of plasma LDL and accelerated development of atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease at a young age. Elevated LDL, including long-term exposure to persistently high or elevated LDL cholesterol, is a major risk factor for the development of atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. And current evidence suggests that elevated LDL cholesterol is the most readily modifiable risk factor. But it's easy said than done. And as we will see at the end of the study, or of the presentation rather, we will see that despite the evidence, despite the presence of the medications, very few people or only minority of people are on cholesterol lowering tablets. So what is the clinical benefit of lowering LDL? The LDL lowering slows the progression of atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, modifies the course of this disease. So going back to the same slide that we've seen, that the reduction of LDL can slow the progression or regress the plaque volume and reduce the risk of development of MI. So if the patient keeps the LDL reduced throughout their life, 125 milligram per deciliter, the reduction of the LDL levels earlier and to a lower level will allow for greater impact of delaying the occurrence of cardiovascular event. In certain hereditary diseases, the guys tend to have very low LDL. So LDL, which is since they were born, they have a low LDL, 28% lower LDL than non-carriers, leads to reduction of coronary heart disease by 88%. And other group of diseases, carriers of the PCSK9 46 allele, by having 15% lower LDL, that is translated into 47% reduction in events. So we have very clear evidence from this hereditary diseases that by having low LDL, there is low cardiovascular disease. And then when statin came in the 80s, and we started to see results by the 90s of LDL reduction by statin, that by having reducing LDL, we have a reduction of events. Using LDL, there is a reduction of events. This is different trials, some of them primary prevention, and some of them secondary prevention. And we came with a conclusion that for each 1 millimole reduction of LDL, there is a 20% reduction of events. Here, maybe the other one is a little bit crowded, but as you can see here, take the 4S trial, which is these are guys who had an acute myocardial infarction. At that time, this paper was published in 1995. So they started them on simvastatin. The majority of them, about 63%, received simvastatin 20 milligram. The 40 milligram, as you know, both 20 milligram and 40 milligram of simvastatin are moderate intensity statin. So those who received the statin, whether it's the 20 milligram of simvastatin, the majority, and about 26 or so received 40 milligram of simvastatin, and their LDL at the beginning was in the range of 170. By the end of the trial, it was still higher. These are guys who had acute myocardial infarction, so their LDL was about 120. But this resulted in a significant reduction of within 5 or 6 years of follow-up of cardiovascular death. These are only beginning, and then after that we had more potent statin, and we've seen here in Improve It, where they started with a lower than at the beginning of in here. So the LDL with simvastatin 40 was in this range. And then we, by adding ezetimibe, then there was a further reduction of LDL, and that resulted in reduction of events. So it seems as if there is no endpoint to where we can get benefit. The lower LDL we get better, reduction in mortality. So from this lipids trial, we've come to a conclusion that for every 1 millimole reduction of LDL, that is for every roughly 39 or 40 milligram reduction of LDL, this is associated with a 20% reduction of cardiovascular events. And without just going in details, so meta-analysis of 26 randomized trials with this large number of patients on statin therapy, we've seen that there is a 21% risk reduction in major vascular events and 20% risk reduction in coronary heart disease mortality and 10% reduction in all-cause mortality. And the same things for other meta-analysis of other trials. At the end of the day, we are very sure that by reducing the LDL, we get better events, less myocardial infarction, less cardiovascular deaths. But if you see here, this is the 4S that I mentioned earlier, still this is the treatment group, but still the reduction, it did compare to the placebo group. Imagine at that time, somebody who had a myocardial infarction, and then you give him a placebo. You do not give him a statin. And then those whom you treat, you only give a moderate intensity statin. So still, even in this group, there is further events. These guys are not free of risk. So then, in like 2016 or so, the results of the PCSK9 inhibitor came. So with the statin and ezetimibe, maybe we were reaching around 90 milligram of deciliter. So these are guys who were on these oral medications, and then they gave them PCSK9 inhibitor, and within 4 weeks, their LDL, those who received evolocumab, the LDL reached down up to about 30 milligram of deciliter. And it continued during the 2 years of the study, and the LDL was very low. And that was, we will see in the other slide, that resulted in a reduction of events and mortality. And from the analysis of that trial, we've reached in some people an LDL as low as less than 20 milligram of deciliter of LDL. And they looked at if there is any harmful effect came from this very low LDL. And it's being shown that the lower that you go, you have less events. So those who had an LDL of 20 or below, they had less cardiovascular events during the 2 years of follow-up. And as the LDL is not as reduced as this one, but still here we are talking about an LDL of 2.5 and so on, so 40 and 50 milligram. But if it's bring it down to 20 is better. And the higher, those who their LDL was about 100, they get more events during the 2 years, or just slightly over 2 years of the study. And there was no any harmful effect. And here, a point to our colleagues in the primary health care, because we see a lot of patients who are high risk. We put them on a larger dose of a statin, and their LDL hardly comes to where we want it, 70 or 60, but some they are seen in the primary health care, and immediately they will be fearful. The doctors, they say, oh, no, your LDL is too low, and then they reduce the statin. So there is no limit, lower limit to harm. Quickly, the lipids treatment guidelines. You do not expect me to go through the guidelines in details, but firstly, I would say the LDL, sorry, the statin are divided into high potency statin. Those are the statins that reduce the LDL by over 50%. The moderate intensity statin that reduce the LDL between 30 to 50, and low intensity statin that's reducing the LDL by less than 30. There is no place in the guidelines for low intensity statin. Occasionally, if somebody is intolerant of the larger dose, then maybe you shift him to a moderate dose, and then if still they have some side effect, then you may use a low intensity statin. But even for primary prevention, there is no place for this. This is the
1 minute.
Okay. So this is the guideline. Since the time does not give me a time to go through it, we have major events and high risk conditions, and this is the European guidelines, so we will not waste time here. So what are the unmet needs? So this is the Da Vinci study, which is a cross-section study for patients who were about roughly 6,000 patients, primary prevention half-half, and secondary prevention. And the result after a follow-up of 2 years, that the use of high intensity statin was only in 22%, the primary prevention in 42% of patients. So this is typical, even these are high risk patients. This is the overall, only 54% attained overall risk-based, the 2016 guidelines, the European, and about only 1/3 they reached the 2019 guidelines. And the same thing for in America, where they did the Palm registry. They looked to overall the use of statin and how many are on high dose of statin, and about 81% retrospective cohort study conducted in Germany from 2012 and 2014 for people with atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. And analysis of the data showed that about 53% of patients discontinued statin therapy during follow-up and real-world retrospective study. So the problem is not here in medium income countries or low income countries, even in the West. This is the idea. The reason why people stop the statin, about after 1 year of being on a statin, about half of the people, they stop the statin. The number one cause is experience side effects or perceived experience side effects. So for the sake of the time, statins are the mainstay of treatment of patients with atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. Many patients treated with a statin-based lipid-lowering therapy are unable to consistently achieve and maintain the LDL target. And for patients who cannot reach and maintain target level of LDL, statins and are at increased risk of cardiovascular event, adjunctive therapy are needed to achieve effective and sustained and lowering the LDL. So the overall summary here, that is atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease is the leading cause of death worldwide. LDL level is the most important cardiovascular risk factor. The relationship between LDL level and cardiovascular mortality and morbidity is well documented. Statins are the backbone of the LDL treatment. and are extensively studied, and the benefits are well documented. Statins alone cannot achieve the desired LDL level in many high-risk patients. Patients with very high LDL level, especially patients with familial dyslipidemia, need to start treatment early in life, as it is demonstrated that the future risk of cardiovascular disease is related to the level of the L and years of exposure. And the last point is that new modalities of therapy of high LDL, such as PCSK9 inhibitor and inclisiran, have demonstrated that in addition to statin therapy, unparalleled low level of LDL can be achieved safely with clear reduction of mortality and cardiovascular events. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Osama, for your talk, and we are sorry we have to cut you for the time. Our next speaker is Prof. Zuhair Awan. He's a professor of medicine, biochemistry, and genetics. He's a consultant clinical epidemiology, and he is one of the leaders of the topic of hyperlipidemia and familial hyperlipidemia in the country. So he will talk about this new medication, inclisiran, the small interfering RNA. Dr. Awan, you can start. Please, if you have any question, you can write it in the Q&A. And we hopefully at the end, we'll have 5 to 10 minutes to answer the question. Dr. Awan, Zuhair Awan, you can start, please.
Thank you, Mr. Sherman. Thank you for the organizers for inviting me to talk about a very exciting topic, which is a small interfering RNA and their application in lipid lowering. So we're going to talk today about inclisiran, the first in class small interfering RNA that lowers LDL cholesterol. So this is my disclosure, and as nicely have been put forward by Prof. Khalid and Dr. Osama, atherosclerotic cardiovascular is the leading cause of death in Saudi Arabia, the main risk factor is dyslipidemia, and we have the early or the youngest average in terms of atherosclerotic cardiovascular, and probably this is because we have a genetic predisposition in terms of high prevalence of familial hypercholesterolemia. So I've tried to simplify the mechanism of action of inclisiran by going to a few basic concepts. Mainly, how is the LDL cholesterol is being regulated by the LDL receptor and PCSK9. Then I will talk about the protein or gene protein synthesis in order to explain the mechanism of action of inclisiran. And finally, I'll be speaking about the dosing and pharmacokinetics. So let's kick start. So the story of lipid includes about 11 Nobel Prize in the field. So if you're in the lipid field, you are in a very vibrant, rich culture of innovation and discovery. The discovery of cholesterol started in the 1769 when Francois de La Salle identified solid cholesterol in the gallstone. And then in the 1913, the lipid hypothesis of atherosclerosis have kick-started. And then in 1929, the discovery of lipoprotein. In the 1950, the start of the large population studies, i.e. Framingham study. So as you all know that the liver produces VLDL or very low density lipoprotein that is catabolized all the way to the low density lipoprotein cholesterol in the blood, and then it recycles back to the liver. The way it's uptake by the liver is through the LDL receptor, and this is where Goldstein and Brown won their Nobel Prize in 1974. Then followed by the discovery of statin by Dr. Endo and the discovery of PCSK9 that kick-started the birth of statin therapy and PCSK9 inhibitors. So let me explain how the LDL cholesterol is regulated in the blood. The LDL circulates in the blood, and then it binds to the LDL receptor on the surface of the hepatocyte. Then it internalized together with the receptor into the endosome, and then the endosome, due to the low pH, dissociate from the receptor. The LDL cholesterol goes to the lysosomal pathway where it's degraded, while the LDL receptor recycled back to the surface. And this is called the LDL receptor recycle. So each time the cholesterol is uptake, the receptor is allowed to circle back to the surface and recruit more cholesterol. And this is how you lower your cholesterol in the blood. So the higher level of LDL receptor, the lower the plasma LDL cholesterol in the blood. And one of the ways that we upregulate the LDL receptor is by giving statin, because statin inhibit the endogenous production of cholesterol in the cell. So the cell feels hungry that it needs cholesterol, so it upregulates the receptor, and you have more expression on the surface, and therefore you take the cholesterol from the blood and lower it further. To add a bit of complexity to the regulation, the discovery of PCSK9, a protease that is expressed highly in the liver in 2003, made a discovery where now we know that the LDL receptor, the same way the LDL receptor is synthesized, PCSK9 is also synthesized. However, it's excreted outside of the hepatocyte, circulates in the blood, and binds to the LDL receptor from the outside. I can give you an example. The PCSK9 is like the glue that ties the LDL cholesterol with the LDL receptor. By doing this, it doesn't allow the LDL receptor to be recycled back. Rather, it pushes the LDL receptor to the lysosomal degradation pathway. And therefore, your LDL receptor is downregulated from the surface of the hepatocyte. And this will lead to, so the higher the PCSK9 you have in the blood, the lower the cell surface LDL receptor, and the higher plasma cholesterol. So when we give statin, what happens is we upregulate the LDL receptor, and at the same time, we upregulate the PCSK9. Therefore, you don't achieve higher lowering in cholesterol in the blood, because the PCSK9 actually is overexpressed as well, and it actually kills the LDL receptor. Therefore, you are limited when you double the dose of statin. By doubling it, you only achieve 7%. This is probably the reason why. So, in essence, if you have high PCSK9, you have a higher plasma cholesterol. And what better example that we can give in human other than the gain of function of PCSK9, where gain of function of PCSK9, whether in higher level or high affinity, leads to abolish of the LDL receptor, and a decrease in the uptake in high, it will lead to high plasma cholesterol in the blood. In essence, this is one cause of hypercholesteremia. On the opposite, when you have loss of function mutations in the PCSK9, you have a lower level of cholesterol in the blood, because you allow the LDL receptor to recycle efficiently and uptake cholesterol from the blood. And this is actually validated when you compare the normal distribution of patient. You can see this is a Bell distribution of the LDL cholesterol. And compare to loss of function nonsense mutation, you can see that the distribution is skewed toward the left, where you have lower plasma and the LDL cholesterol. And this is actually reflected on the lower coronary event if you compare the normal allele of PCSK9 to the nonsense or loss of function PCSK9. You see about 80%, 88% reduction in coronary artery disease. So in concept, lowering PCSK9 actually is beneficial, and it's associated with lower cardiovascular disease. So this concept caught like fire with pharmaceutical companies, and they started to target PCSK9. They started targeting with a monoclonal antibody in order to take it out from the system, allowing the efficiency of the LDL receptor. So they started with highly immunogenic monoclonal antibody or polyclonal antibody, and it ended up with a very low immunogenic, fully humanized antibody. So the two molecules that are in the market are oleclumab and eviculumab. They are monoclonal antibody, fully humanized, and they are administered every 2 weeks. And they're very efficient in lowering the LDL cholesterol by about 60 to 70% on top of the conventional oral hypolipidemic agent. So can we improve on this concept? And instead of taking the PCSK9 out of the system by targeting with monoclonal antibody, can you actually stop producing PCSK9? So the idea was, probably impossible in the past, but after we have the information or the explosion of information from the human project that showed that between 2 to 5% of the whole genome actually encodes for genes that produce protein. The rest actually doesn't code for any protein, and the function was thought that is related to the non-coding region that regulate the genes of interest. So now I will shift to gene protein synthesis to understand how we can actually prevent the synthesis of PCSK9 as a protein. So to refresh your genetic information, your DNA is your cookbook. It doesn't leave the nucleus. What leaves the nucleus is the messenger RNA that is complementary or that is representing the gene of interest through a process called transcription. And then when it reaches the cytoplasm, it is bound to ribosome, and then your protein start to be synthesized. In 2006, Fire and Milan were awarded the Nobel Prize for discovering of the RNA interference. So this is a huge discovery where they have found that there's many applications that RNA therapeutic harness the nature of biology, the biological pathway of RNA interference that regulate the expression of specific genes. Now we can talk about gene silencing, where in the past we were dreaming of it. Now we can use it actually to target a specific gene and silence certain proteins. So by synthetic short or small interfering RNA, we can target a unique mRNA and prevent the protein from being made from the start. So you can actually shut down the protein rather than targeting it with monoclonal antibody. So there's a lot of application explored in the theme of either targeting coronavirus or specific targets, including liver disease, CNS, and beyond. So it's very innovative. It's very interesting process where your gene produce long double-strand RNA. This double-strand RNA coils around, then through an enzyme called dicer, which is an RNase, it cleaves this double-strand RNA to a small interfering RNA. It is still double-strand. One strand is going to be your guided strand. The other is going to be your passenger strand. And these two strands bind to something called RISC, which is RNA-induced silencing complex. Once it binds to it, it has also an enzyme called arginate 2. It degrades the passenger strand and allows any messenger RNA that is complementary to the guided strand to bind, where it's going to again degrade the messenger RNA. So it will be like a destructive machine that targets any produced mRNA that is trying to synthesize a protein. So now we understand how small interfering RNA mechanism. Now we can apply it to PCSK9. So inclisiran is the first small interfering RNA. It is about, one strand is 21, the other one is 32 mer, double strand. It has the dark blue is the guided strand, where the light blue is the passenger strand. And why there's two strands? In order to protect this small strand from being tuned up by exonucleases and endonucleases. So they are complementary, protecting each other. The end are also protected by phosphorothioate. Now, once we have this molecule, small interfering RNA, if we inject it directly in the body, it will go everywhere. But one of the innovation that pharma company have came up with is a delivery mechanism. And there's many delivery mechanisms. One of it is conjugating the molecule or incorporating it in a lipid nanoparticles or liposome. And in terms of N-glycerin, it's actually conjugated with GalNAc or N-acetyl galactosamine in GalNAc, and this function to target this molecule to the liver because it specifically binds to a tissue-specific receptor on the hepatocyte called acylglycoprotein receptor. So this is expressed uniquely in the liver, and therefore you can target this molecule to the liver rather than giving it and it goes everywhere. So let's go again and summarize everything. Now your body produces PCSK9 through transcribing a messenger RNA. Once messenger RNA goes into cytoplasm, now protein is being made. The protein now is excreted outside the hepatocyte, circulates, binds to the elder receptor, and targets the elder receptor to the degradation pathway. Your body also synthesizes. You can also synthesize now. Once you give the N-glycerin, the N-glycerin now binds to the acylglycoprotein receptor on the hepatocyte, internalize, and this GalNAc now is disassociate, and it goes outside, bind to the RISC complex. The passenger strand is degraded. Now this molecule acts as a mechanism or a machine that degrades any messenger RNA is trying to produce PCSK9. So now there is no PCSK9. The result is your LDL receptor is freely available to recycle back and forth, and therefore it uptakes the cholesterol, internalize it, use it, and goes back to the surface. So the cycle is more efficient. Therefore, you tightly or aggressively lower your LDL cholesterol. So I will spend a few slides on the dosing and administration. N-glycerin is prepared in a pre-made syringe with 1.5 ml of solution per syringe. The concentration is 300 milligrams of N-glycerin sodium. The unique or the beauty of this medication, it can be stored at room temperature. The initial dose acts like a priming because the initial dose is used up to fill all of the endosome in the hepatocyte. The next dose would be after 3 months, and each 6 months will be like a maintenance dose. So the beauty is going to be also the spacing and the simplicity of giving the medication because it's given every 6 months. Clinical investigation in the Orion development program determine the efficacy, safety, and tolerability of the drug. The administration is subcutaneous, injection in the body and the abdomen by a healthcare professional to make sure that the medication is given at the right time. So let's talk about the mechanism of, or the metabolism of the molecule. As we said that the two molecules are double-stranded because they protect each other. Once the GalNAc is being lost, then the exonucleases start to chew up the nucleotides from the 3' end, and it solely shortened the strand. The same way the guided strand will be also exposed. They all go to the hepatic nucleotide pool and then be eliminated from the body by the bile route. In plasma, after between 24 to 48 hours, is undetectable in the blood, and because it's concentrated completely in the liver. There is no side effect because it doesn't go through the cytochrome P450 system. Therefore, there's no drug-drug interaction. The only elimination route is through the kidney. 16% of inclisiran is cleared through this system. So in summary, there is no drug interaction expected because we don't use the cytochrome P450. Co-administration with atorvastatin was not associated with any toxicity, no dose limiting toxicity, no genotoxic or carcinogenic effect, no off-target effect observed. There is no effect on infertility or embryonic development. You don't need to adjust a patient with renal failure or hepatic impairment. The only side effect is going to be the injection site reaction, like any other injection, and it's about 5%. So one of the things that Dr. Khalid or Prof. Khalid has alluded, we need a very strong medication that sustains the lowering effect of the drug. So in Orient 10, this has been achieved, where you can see that about 52% effective drop in LDL compared to placebo, between the placebo arm and the inclisiran arm. It was sustained all the way to 18 months. And inclisiran, the brand name Lakeview, was approved in the European for adult with hypercholesterolemia and mixed dyslipidemia, while in the United States was approved in adult with clinical atherosclerosis, cardiovascular disease, and heterozygous familial hypercholesterolemia. In Saudi Arabia, is approved with primary hypercholesterolemia and mixed dyslipidemia. So in summary, small interfering RNA is a new class of medication that lowers LDL with a novel mechanism. Twice yearly subcutaneous injection is a novel regimen. It's never been given before in 2 doses per year. There's an excellent preclinical pharmacokinetic and toxicokinetic profile. Outcome studies are conducted through the Orion development program, and we are all anticipating a good result and lowering in cardiovascular disease, inshallah. With that, I conclude and will be very happy to answer any question, whether now or the end of the session. Taking it back to Dr. Baha.
Thank you, Dr. Zuhair, for simplifying the mechanism of action. Actually, it was very interesting. And we will make the question and answer at the end of our last presentation. Our last presentation with Dr. Uwaid al-Shammari. He's a consultant interventional cardiologist in Al-Habib group. He's one of the prominent interventionists in the area. Dr. Uwaid.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction, Doctor. But I'll share right now my presentation. Okay. So I'll try to be short as the time is approaching to the end. This is my disclosure. So I'll start with a case. A 47-year-old gentleman is known to have CAD and PVD, had primary PCI to RCA last year, and left subclavian artery chronic total occlusion intervention also last year. He has hypertension, dyslipidemia, LDL was 1.3 on rosuvastatin 40, ezetimibe 10, and evolocumab. He asked me personally for comfort reasons to use Lakeview. As he heard me talking about it in one of the media, and shall I start it with him or not? So I would like to see the opinion of the panelists as well as the attendee, if there is any other idea. So I would like to start with what's the clinical benefit of lowering LDL. So we already talked about in the first presentation by Prof. Khalid, and also the other speakers, where the effect of LDL is not only at the time, or the majority of the LDL actually is an exposure. By reducing it, we're reducing the risks and may get the events later on in life. This is the hypothesis, and it's most likely is true, or I believe it personally to be true. And in the guidelines, that's why they started with baseline LDL level and see the indication of the drug therapy. If not, or yes, then define the treatment goals and see whether the patient has very high risk or high risk or moderate risk. As a cardiologist, most of the patients are in the very high risk. Some of them are in the high risk. Then the journey starts with the statin, then the adherence, sometimes on, sometimes off, side effects here and there. It's really tough job to keep them on these medicines in the light of the side effects of our communities. It is more than what we see in the Western literature, that patients, the adherence. And we are not also exceptions, that the use of the maladherence with time happens with the statin. Not only that, most of the patients are not achieving the target, and as Khalid showed, more than 50% are not achieving the target LDL. Then we'll get another drug, ezetimibe, which is another cost, and another pill. And this pill is in addition to the other 5 pills the patient is taking: aspirin, clopidogrel, beta blocker, ACE inhibitors, and sometimes calcium channel blocker to control hypertension. And most of the time, we don't get the target. Then we'll go to the adding PCSK9 every 2 weeks. Patients should remember to inject this. So the revolution of the inclisiran, not only to help us at that stage, it may help us more earlier than this, because it's very short time of agony of the needle, and for sure it's on spot where the medical professional do it. Not only that, we ensure that the patients get the benefit for 6 months. This is what I think is the LDL is the most important target, rather than what they're talking about, the pleiotropic effect, which exists, and people in their career spend time improving this pleiotropic effect, atherosclerosis of inflammation reduced by statin. But I think the LDL is the main thing. So LDL is like the fuel to the charger that comes from the inflammation. So if you don't have that fuel, then whatever charger you have, it will not get that impact if you don't have that fuel. So reducing this fuel hopefully will reduce the main drive to the clinical benefit when we see in the lipid-lowering therapies. So how could this revolutionize the ASCVD? We need something to ensure efficacy to reduce LDL. We need something to ensure safety. And we have these things. We have statin, we have ezetimibe, we have PCSK9 inhibitors. If we ensure their adherence, they are pretty effective and very safe. We know that they are very safe, but the problem is the adherence. It's not only 1 year or 2 years or 3 years, it's on and on, 10, 15 years, especially when we know Khalid showed us in his work that our people with coronary artery disease, they are 1 decade earlier than the Western literatures. We are in the 40s, and now we are moving sometimes in the 30s. People are 30, got coronary artery disease, they need to be in lipid-lowering therapy for the rest of their life. So how can I ensure the adherence? This is the main challenge that we are facing as a cardiologist in treating patients with at very high risk of major cardiovascular events. And we know the cardiovascular diseases are #1 cause of death in Saudi Arabia. How it is administered, as Dr. Zuhair mentioned, is first is the day 1, day 90, then 6 months, then every 6 months. And the other trick is administered by health professional and no adjustment for renal impairment patients. And if we think about the adherence here, if we got the high potency statins, you got 365 pills, and the monoclonal antibodies, 26 injections every month, two injections. But with the inclisiran, 2 injections per year. So this reminds us about the vaccinations, flu vaccines, and the gene therapy is once in a lifetime. So each drug of these, each medicine of these should take into account how many times we are giving as a bonus for that drug. So basically, inclisiran provides effective and sustained LDL lowering, as showed by Zuhair, that by the Orion 9, 10, and 11. And we're looking forward to see Orion 4, which is the one having 15,000 of patients, and the outcomes will be ready, inshallah, by July 2026, and the end of the study is 2049. With the 2 doses per day, inclisiran is a strong complement to statin to achieve effective and sustained LDL. The question here, should I wait till 2049 to know this drug is beneficial to my patients who are not taking PCSK9 most of the time, or they have side effects of statin therapy? I need to wait. So I know from Orion 9, 10, and 11 that they are the safety profile are in 3,500 patients are very good, and they are similar to placebo, and up to 2 years follow-up. So I think we need to be in those specific patients where we think that they are not adherent, or the challenges of adherence, like my patient, even he's a cardiovascular patient, will be beneficial for him. So I started him actually in Lakeview, and I stopped the PCSK9 and continued the statins and ezetimibe. And if he wants to stop ezetimibe, if the LDL is okay, I'm okay with that to cut the cost. What safety profile for inclisiran? Here is in Orion 9, they showed the adverse events, and severe adverse events were generally similar between inclisiran and placebo. And this is Orion 9, which is conducted in the heterozygous familial dyslipidemia, and Orion 10 for atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease patients, and it showed the same thing. There is no difference between adverse event and severe adverse event. And Orion 11, which conducted in atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease patients and equivalent patients, and they found also the same thing. The adverse events and severe adverse events were generally similar between the inclisiran and placebo. And when we look deep in this study, the count for everything here. So here, the more than one adverse event is 82.7 in the inclisiran and 81.5 in placebo. So the count for every single side effects, I think, is, I don't know any other trial that showed adverse event is 81% of the patients in placebo. This helped me to take this reliably that it is a safe drug. And in renal impairment, also there is no difference in the side effects, though the mean plasma concentration of glycerin is increased in the first 24 hours, the area under the curve in those patients, depending on the renal failure, but afterward they are the same, all of them. Studies are ongoing to evaluate glycerin long-term outcomes, 48 months, Orion 3, Orion 8, and Orion 4. Orion 4 is the most important one. That it has 15,000 patients. Hopefully in 4 years from now, we will hear some news about the breaking in one of the sessions in breaking news. What's the safety profile of inclisiran? It was well tolerated with safety profile similar to placebo in the current evidence at hand. And the safety profile for inclisiran has been informed in more than 3,500 patients by a comprehensive clinical development program, including 3 confirmatory phase 3 studies. Treatment-related adverse events were similar in both groups, with exceptions of injection site reaction that only during that visit once in 6 months, but none were severe or persistent. Severe adverse event or adverse events leading to discontinuation were also balanced among both arms. The ongoing cardiovascular outcome trials, Orion 4, approximately 15,000 patients, and data from open label extension trials of the phase 3 programs, Orion 3 and 8, will provide additional information on a long-term safety profile. Kind of a wrap-up of my colleagues' talks and my talk is the atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, the leading cause of cardiovascular disease morbidity and mortality. And this actually is number one. There is no one, in my humble opinion, would have coronary artery disease without having atherosclerosis or dyslipidemia. Whether the LDL is 0 or not, they do have atherosclerosis. Then they do have dyslipidemia. Current evidence suggests that elevated LDL cholesterol is the most readily modifiable risk factor of atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. Lowering LDL directly leads to significantly improved cardiovascular outcomes. So it is the LDL more than anything else to lower the major adverse cardiac events. Many patients treated with statin-based lipid-lowering therapy are unable to consistently achieve and maintain their LDL, especially our patients who are started to have these medications way early on age, in 30s or 40s. Inclisiran is the first and only therapy that utilizes the small interference RNA mechanism of actions to lower LDL cholesterol, mimics the body process of RNA interference to increase the LDL receptors in the liver, thus increasing the clearance of cholesterol. Inclisiran provide effective and sustained LDL lowering, as shown in the Orion, the 9, 10, 11, and we saw the diversion of the graph is beautifully shown, like what was seen in and impressively seen in Odyssey and Fourier trial. Treatment-related adverse events were similar in the inclisiran placebo groups, with exception of injection site reaction that were more frequent in the inclisiran, obviously, but it's mild and only during that visit in 6 months. Inclisiran is appropriate for people with elevated LDL cholesterol level who do not achieve guideline recommended threshold with statin. And I expect in future that it may expand the rule more and more. Why not? With 2 doses per year, inclisiran is a strong complement to statin to achieve effective and sustained LDL reduction. At present time, this is our recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Uwaid. Actually, we have a question. I think you can answer this one. Can we use inclisiran alone, Dr. Uwaid?
At present time, no. We have to stick to the guidelines.
Other question we have from Jamal. So the question is step-up approach versus combination lipid-lowering therapy from day one in patient with very high LDL. You kind of touch on this in your lecture. So what's your approach, Dr. Awayed? You go for step-up approach, patient presenting with very high risk, as you said in intervention cardiology, most of the patient is a very high risk. So patient present, MI, very high LDL.
Yeah.
You start with a step-up approach. For example, high intensity statin plus ezetrol. You wait 8 weeks. You see what's the result, or you start a combination. You throw everything from day one.
Yeah, this is, I wish that you asked this question to Dr. Khalid, but I would add one thing, that the patients are not the same. There is a patient with the STEMI, there is a patient with STEMI, among the very highest patients. There is a patient with STEMI, there is a patient with STEMI and the LDL of 6, there is a patient with STEMI and stroke, and there is a patient with STEMI, diabetes, and peripheral vascular disease. They are not the same. So according to the risk, I go how aggressive I am. But in general, the general rule, I go as per the guidelines. If naive, high dose statin therapy, then step up with ezetrol, ezetimibe in 6 weeks follow-up, then 6 weeks follow-up, then step up with the PCSK9 inhibitors, and I take in my mind the inclisiran is not yet approved for secondary prevention. But as I mentioned in my patient who is young and he is threatening that he cannot anymore take all of these medicines.
Prof. Khalid.
Prof.
Khalid, مساء الخير.
Yes. The first patient I used with inclisiran is a 36-year-old lady with LDL of 8. And she clearly has familial hypercholesterolemia. Her brother has high LDL above 5. Her mother also had hypercholesterolemia in her 40s. So typical patient for inclisiran, and basically she was already on high dose statin, rosuvastatin 40, ezetrol 10, and I added a monoclonal antibody for PCSK9, and her LDL dropped with a triple therapy to 1.6. So, and then I counseled her about switching from monoclonal antibody to inclisiran, and she agreed. She was excited, actually. She said, only 2 injections per year. That's great. And that was in December 2021. And after 2 months, I repeated her LDL and rosuvastatin high dose and ezetrol and inclisiran, and still the LDL was 1.6. So achieve the target according to the guidelines, and hopefully she will only maintain this level on only 2 doses. When it comes to the other question regarding secondary prevention, then you have to really go through according to the studies, we have evidence from the RIME program, as has been mentioned by Awayed and Zuhair and others, that basically we have evidence even in atherosclerotic disease that they achieve the target. I mean, the argument here is, do you wait for years to have the outcome study and deprive patients from the benefit in something that has been shown again and again and again, that LDL reduction translates into clinical evidence? That would be interesting discussion in the panel. For me, I would switch to such a drug, which is more of a convenience to the patient. This is the way I would counsel the patient. I said, you have 2 options. In very high-risk patients or high-risk patients, you can argue, as Dr. Jamal question is, Do you start in very high-risk patients immediately with triple therapy? The problem with this very smart question that many patients, one would argue, well, give the highest dose of statin and isotrol as a combination from the very beginning. So at least 2 medications. If you have the luxury of seeing the patients in 2 months' time or 6 weeks, according to the guidelines, yes. But the problem I have with this model that many patients get followed up after 6 months and 1 year, particularly in the government. So it depends on your hospital setting. In the private sector, where many of us practice, we can see the patients within 6 weeks and 2 months, and you can know the LDL within 2 months. So you still have a chance of really seeing, could you achieve the target LDL in these high-risk patients? But if you're gonna see the patient after 6 months or 8 months, one, you're not following the guidelines, and it's out of your hand because it's a very busy practice, unfortunately, in the government. And two, it depends how high the LDL as well. Where did you start in that high-risk patient? STEMI patient with LDL of 8 is different from an LDL of 3.3, for example. And we all have seen all kinds of patients. So I think the devil in the details, as they say. I mean, give me the full details and I'll tell you whether start the triple therapy or the double therapy. But definitely what we learned from all the nice presentations today, that statin alone is not going to work in this high-risk patients, according to the recent guidelines. You have to start at least with double therapy and very high doses.
Thank you, Prof. Khalid. I think you are the first physician to prescribe inclisiran in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, the first patient, this is exactly the patient, the 36-year-old. Unfortunately, she's having trouble with her insurance. So I hope that she will try to sort it out and get back she's due. By the way, you have to give another booster dose once you start the first dose. So she's due for the 3-month booster dose, and then every 6 months. I tried, like what Wade said, is basically tried in atherosclerotic disease patients, a patient who had PCI twice, and she had classic statin intolerance, so slightly different from Wade's patient. So classic, she did not tolerate any, like 2 to 3 drugs of statins. I have no other option, either to give her the PCSK9 or inclisiran, and the insurance refused. So what is the option for such a patient? She's high risk, very high risk patient. She had multiple PCIs. She classic statin intolerance. So what is my option? So I think we have to really still entertain PCSK9 inhibition through monoclonal antibody, or now the new drug, the small interference RNA for such a patients. And we do have many of them. Have you seen that recent meta-analysis in circulation that shows that up to 8% of our patients have statin intolerance? So we really have to be careful about not only high-risk patients, many of them have classic myalgias. And if you really pay attention to and ask your patients, many of them will have muscle pains and they think that they're getting older. And it's not getting older. They have myalgias because of statins.
I believe we don't have any more questions. I would like to thank our speakers for their elegant talks. I would like to thank Saudi Heart and Kunuz Ritaj and the sponsor Novartis for arranging this webinar. And hopefully we will have another webinar in the future for the same topic with more updated studies.
Probably at an earlier time in the day, so we are more awake and probably give more time for discussion, because I feel it's unfair after all these great talks that we only give 5 minutes for discussion. I believe we should give at least another like half an hour, but I guess it's too late now. But I agree with you, it would be really great to have cases to be discussed and listen to all of you answering questions.